The first thing I heard was a loud bang. And the second thing I saw was a woman in yoga pants sprinting across my lease property with a smartphone in one hand and a clipboard in the other, screaming something about a citation while I was still holding the rifle I just legally used to drop a buck from 80 yards out. I hadn't even had time to breathe in the cold morning air before she was huffing through the brush like a suburban banshee. "You can't hunt here," she barked, waving her arms like I just shot her pet. I blinked. "Excuse me," was all I could say. She held out a ticket already filled out with my name, which she must have gotten from the mailbox down the road. Violation of HOA Bylaw 14.9.2. No hunting, trapping, or discharge of firearms within Ridgepine Estates or its adjacent holdings. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or reload. "Ma'am, this isn't Ridgepine Estates. This is leased private land from the Harrow Ranch. I've been hunting here since the lease was signed last fall." She gave me that tight, condescending smile you only see from someone who drives an overpriced SUV and thinks their name matters more than boundary lines. "That may be what you think," she said, eyes gleaming. "But it looks like Ridgepine land to me. I've already filed the violation with our legal committee. Expect a fine." And just like that, she strutted off into the trees like she'd just written a citation to a raccoon. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with something far worse than a nosy neighbor. I was dealing with Dana Ehlers, president of the Ridgepine HOA, queen of her own fictional empire, and a woman so entitled she believed her authority extended to land she didn't even own. But that's when something in my gut shifted. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't even tear up the ridiculous piece of paper she left fluttering in the breeze. I just looked at her retreating figure, then looked at the land around me and quietly said to myself, not for long. 2 hours later, I was having coffee with Mr. Harrow, the elderly rancher who still owned every square inch of these woods. And let's just say the conversation that followed would have made Dana Ehlers faint. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That morning, after Dana left in a huff, I loaded the buck into my truck and drove it down the gravel path toward the old hunting cabin that sat tucked between 2 rows of longleaf pines, my boots kicking up frost from the still frozen ground. I had always loved this land, not just for the hunting, but for its quiet dignity. When I leased it from Harrow, he told me it wasn't much to look at, but it was mine to use, and the terms were simple. Respect the land, clean up after yourself, and don't let fools mess it up. It was that last part that now haunted me, because I'd let a fool walk across the property, scream in my face, and leave thinking she had any power over me. I was still fuming when I got back to the cabin, tossed my rifle on the cot, and started gutting the deer outside beneath the hanging pole. But I wasn't mad at Dana. Not really. I was mad at myself for letting her think she could win. That's when I pulled out my phone and called Harrow. The man answered on the second ring, his voice as dusty and dry as the land he owned. I told him what happened, how the HOA was trying to fine me for legally hunting on his lease, and how Dana had walked right onto his land without even checking boundaries. He went quiet for a second, then let out a slow laugh. "Sounds like you met Ridgepine's Rottweiler," he said. "That woman's been trying to bully everyone around here for years. She even tried to tell me I needed to remove my cattle fence because it was unsightly." I asked him a question. I didn't expect him to say yes to. "Would you ever consider selling?" The silence that followed felt like it stretched across the whole mountain. Then he said, "How fast can you get to the diner?" 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a booth at Marilou's, sipping burnt coffee and going over old survey maps on a wrinkled napkin while a waitress named Glenda listened in like it was a soap opera. Harrow slid a worn folder across the table and said, "Everything outside the Ridgepine gate, that's still mine. But if you want it, I'll give it to you for a fair price on one condition." I raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" He grinned. "Promise me you'll give that HOA hell." Deal made. We shook hands and 2 weeks later, the deed was in my name. 40 acres of Hardwood Creek access, an old gravel road, and the best part, it wrapped around the backside of Ridgepine Estates like a bear circling a campsite. And I didn't tell a soul. Not yet, because revenge, like venison stew, is best served after a long, slow simmer. Dana, meanwhile, must have thought her citation scared me off because she sent a second one in the mail. This time with a late fee attached and a threat to escalate it to county enforcement. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my jerky. This woman still didn't understand that I wasn't part of her HOA. I wasn't even part of her zip code. I was just the quiet guy who leased a piece of land that she happened to be delusional enough to think she controlled. But now that land was mine and the game had changed, the real question wasn't whether I'd fight back. It was how loud I'd make the message when I did. I spent the next few days walking the boundary line with a GPS, hammering in metal stakes, and flagging the edges in bright orange tape. I installed trail cameras that uploaded to my phone in real time. I even upgraded the lock on the gate. Nobody said a word, but I knew eyes were watching from behind those ridgepine hedges. They always watched, but they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that the next time Dana tried to march onto my land, she wouldn't just be trespassing. She'd be making the biggest mistake of her suburban empire because I wasn't just some guy with a lease anymore. I was the landowner now, and the landowner doesn't get fined. He makes the rules. And Dana was about to learn that the hard way. The diner where I sealed the deal with Mr. Harrow looked like the kind of place where gossip came free with every refill. But I didn't care who heard us that day. I left with a deed, a handshake, and a smile that didn't leave my face for the rest of the week. I didn't tell a soul, not even my brother, who lived 2 counties over and had helped me haul firewood last season. This was something I wanted to keep airtight until the timing was right. The paperwork was expedited through Harrow's lawyer, a crusty old man who specialized in keeping deals like this quiet and fast. In just over a week, the 40-acre parcel that wrapped like a lasso around the backside of Ridgepine Estates was legally mine. I owned the land that Dana Ellers once smugly called adjacent HOA holdings. The first thing I did was take a walk through every corner of it, not just to admire it, but to map it. I wanted to understand every inch of the terrain before I made my next move. I traced the creek to where deer often drank. Ran my fingers across the bark of century-old oaks, and even came across the rusted frame of an old wagon that must have been left by Harrow's grandfather or older. The land spoke in creaks and rustles, and the faint whisper of wind threading through pine needles, but it was mine now, and it would speak for me soon enough. I spent the next few days drafting plans, not with architects or landscapers, but with a worn notebook and a cup of strong black coffee. The goal wasn't to build anything fancy. It was to send a message, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The first order of business was surveying the property boundaries with absolute precision. I hired a licensed surveyor just to have the updated documents and GPS logs on hand. I didn't want anything Dana could argue against. Every line was remarked, flagged, and documented in photograph. I saved digital backups, printed copies, and filed a notice with the county recorder's office to ensure nobody could claim ignorance later. Meanwhile, Ridgepine's weekly newsletter, which a buddy of mine forwarded to me out of sheer amusement, featured a front-page blurb about increased activity near the northwest border and how residents should remain alert and vigilant of unauthorized hunting. Dana, of course, had written the blurb herself. She signed it at the bottom like she was issuing royal decrees. That same buddy who worked as a delivery driver told me Dana had been spotted pacing her backyard with a pair of binoculars and a walkie-talkie, convinced some rogue outdoorsman was lurking too close to the HOA's turf if she only knew. I didn't retaliate right away. That would have been too easy. I wanted her to dig the hole deeper herself. Instead, I started preparing the land, fixing the gate that had sagged for years, and running new wire along the eastern side where the old cattle fence had collapsed. I cleared brush along the edges of what used to be an informal trail that Ridgepine residents had used for years as a shortcut to the creek. I didn't close it off yet, but I left bright orange signs that read, "Survey in progress. No trespassing violators will be prosecuted." It was bait and it worked faster than I thought. Within 2 days, one of my new trail cams caught Dana's husband, Bill, walking their golden retriever right past one of the signs and letting the dog defecate near a flagged stake. I didn't even get mad. I just saved the footage, timestamped it, and added it to the folder I was slowly building under the label HOA interference evidence. That same week, I dropped off a sealed envelope to the Ridgepine HOA office address to Dana. Inside was a copy of my deed, the county-verified survey, and a simple cover letter that read, "Please find enclosed documentation confirming ownership of parcel 110D, previously leased, now privately held. All HOA claims on this land are void." Future trespassing will be documented and reported. I heard she fainted. I can't confirm it, but a neighbor later told me Dana locked herself in her house for 2 days and missed her book club meeting, which in Richpine terms was basically a public breakdown. She tried to call me, of course. Left me 2 voicemails and an email demanding a professional mediation session, whatever that means. I ignored them. The power of silence does more than 1,000 angry words. Instead, I spent that weekend building something a little more permanent. The first few panels of a privacy fence. I didn't rush. I measured each post carefully, used pressure-treated lumber, and made sure it was all within the boundary lines. It started near the back trail Dana's HOA had used for years, and ran along the creek, curling just close enough to be visible from her back deck without touching her land. My phone buzzed at 7:00 a.m. the next Monday. It was a sheriff's deputy. Apparently, Dana had filed a complaint for obstruction of community property access. I explained everything, sent him the deed and survey, and then offered him coffee when he stopped by to verify the boundary markers. He left 10 minutes later, chuckling and shaking his head. The next HOA newsletter had no mention of me, but several residents began quietly pulling their trash cans to the curb a little earlier, waving awkwardly if they saw me near the road. The illusion of HOA supremacy had cracked, but it wasn't broken yet. That came a few days later when Dana parked her shiny silver Lexus SUV partly across my newly marked property line. The boundary wasn't even hard to see. I'd laid fresh gravel on one side and marked it with neon-painted stake. Yet there it sat, 2 tires clearly on my side of the line. Maybe it was an accident, maybe a test. Either way, I treated it like destiny. I spent an hour that morning completing a section of the fence I hadn't yet touched. And when I was done, the Lexus was surrounded on 3 sides by newly installed panels and a locked gate. I didn't trap her in. She could still technically back out, but the optics were delicious. At 4:17 p.m., the shriek echoed from her deck all the way to my cabin. I was sitting on a camp chair, sipping lemonade and watching a pair of squirrels bicker over an acorn. "You fenced my car in," she screeched, storming across the yard. I stood calm as ever. "No, ma'am. I built a fence on my property. Your car just happens to be partially on it." She pointed a trembling finger. "You're insane." I tilted my head. "Then why are you parked on my land?" That shut her up for a second. Then came the tears, the shouting, the threats of lawsuits, injunctions, and how she had influence on the county board. I reminded her that county board members still answer to property deeds, not delusions. She demanded I take the fence down. I told her I'd consider it if she signed a notarized letter admitting she was trespassing. She turned beet red and marched back to her house. I waited until she was out of sight, then locked the new gate with a heavy chain. That night, I cooked venison chili and watched the trail cam footage of Dana pacing like a lunatic near her fence-trapped Lexus. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. But now the game had officially begun. Richpine thought they ran the rules. They didn't realize I now owned the field. By the time Dana called the sheriff about her Lexus being illegally trapped inside my fence, I had already prepared a neat folder of documents, time-stamped photos, and GPS coordinates proving exactly where the property line fell and how her vehicle had wandered over it like a nosy tourist in the wrong country. The deputy arrived mid-morning, a younger guy named Tatum, who clearly had dealt with Dana before because the first thing he did when he stepped out of his cruiser was sigh. She came storming out of her front door like she was leading a cavalry charge, gesturing wildly and insisting I had maliciously imprisoned her vehicle. I waited patiently on my side of the fence, arms crossed, offering the kind of polite smile that makes people angrier than yelling ever could. Tatum walked the line, took one look at my stakes, the paint, the video I had ready on my phone, showing the placement before the Lexus was even parked, and turned back to Dana with a shrug. "Ma'am," he said, "your car is on his land. He's not in the HOA. He's within his rights." She exploded, red-faced, hair flying, accusing me of everything from intimidation to terrorism. Tatum didn't flinch. "If you want your vehicle, I suggest you ask him nicely." That part nearly killed her. She turned to me, fists clenched. "Can I please have my car back?" She hissed. I unlocked the gate slowly, dramatically, and watched her back it out with the caution of a cat walking on ice. As soon as it cleared the line, I shut the gate and relocked it. Dana stomped off, muttering legal threats that dissolved into curses. That night, I installed 2 more trail cameras, not because I was paranoid, but because I knew people like Dana. They didn't stop. They escalated. And I was right. 2 days later, I caught footage of her walking along the fence line, phone in hand, measuring tape swinging at her side like she was prepping for a courtroom drama. She crouched down at one of my posts, pulled out a small level, and even tried to dig a little near the base like she could prove it wasn't sunk deep enough to be legal. I reported it to the county as trespassing, submitted the video, and CC'd the HOA's general email address just for good measure. No response came, but I didn't need one. I knew every HOA member was talking now, especially since I'd started building out more of the fence directly along the popular walking trail they'd used as a shortcut to the creek. I wasn't blocking the public path yet, just making it clear where the land started and where it didn't welcome Ridgepine's petty rules. The orange no trespassing signs grew more frequent, and a new one appeared at the entrance of the trail. Private land beyond this point not affiliated with HOA violators will be prosecuted. That was the shot that sent Dana into DEFCON 1. A new letter arrived in my mailbox typed in formal legalese but barely holding back her indignation. It was from the HOA's attorney, a man named Franklin Hartley, demanding I cease and desist all fence construction and refrain from any further obstruction of Ridgepine's designated pedestrian easement. I responded with a scanned copy of the property deed, the updated survey, a screenshot of the trail cam footage showing their residents continuing to cross into my land, and a highlighted copy of the county's easement laws, which confirmed there was no such designation. In fact, the county hadn't recorded any easement on my parcel in over 30 years. Hartley sent no reply. I imagine Dana was losing her mind inside that beige fortress of a house, surrounded by matching lawn chairs and overpriced gnomes, screaming at a man whose only crime was putting up a fence and knowing how to read a legal plat. The absurdity of it all didn't make me angry anymore. It made me laugh. I'd sit outside some evenings, chair propped back, cold beer in hand, watching as HOA members would walk their little dogs up the trail, pause at the sign, read it with exaggerated expressions of confusion, and slowly backtrack like they'd wandered into Area 51. I installed motion-sensitive lights at key corners of the fence just to spook the more persistent ones at night. One older couple actually waved at me and said they understood completely. Said Dana had tried to fine them once for having unapproved ivy in their garden. I offered them a cup of coffee and they accepted. Turned out not everyone in Ridgepine was insufferable. Just most of them, especially Dana. She doubled down after that, filing a complaint with the county zoning board that I was running an unregistered business out of the wood. Apparently, she saw me guiding 2 friends on a hunting weekend and assumed I was operating an unlicensed outfitter company. When the county inspector arrived, he asked me what I was doing. I said I was letting 2 buddies stay at my cabin and hunt deer with me on my land with legal tags and weapons. The inspector checked my papers, looked around, saw my permits in order, and asked if I had any leftover coffee. We shared a cup while I showed him the photos of Dana's repeated trespassing attempts. He chuckled, thanked me for my cooperation, and advised me to keep the cameras rolling. After he left, I made a decision. It was time to cut the leash. The next day, I replaced the wooden signs with something a little more permanent. Steel posts sunk in concrete and heavy-duty aluminum signs that read, "No HOA access. Private property trail permanently closed." I bolted a chain across the old footpath and added a note below. Trespassers will be recorded and reported. This is not a suggestion. That evening, I watched from my deck as Dana arrived in her usual windbreaker and sunglasses disguise, walked to the trailhead, and stopped dead. Her arms flailed, her lips moved in furious silence, and she whipped out her phone, probably to call her favorite deputy again. He never came. Nobody did. The next newsletter Ridgepine sent out warned residents of increased wildlife activity and urged them to limit exposure to bordering areas, which was their way of saying, stay the hell off his land before you end up in court. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because the final piece of the puzzle was yet to be laid, and it would make everything that came before it look like a warm-up act. All Dana had to do was push a little further, and I was ready. The cameras were in place. The fence was nearly complete. And in my pocket, tucked beside my license and keys, was a folded court order waiting for her next move. The following morning began like any other, with mist curling up from the creek bed and the rustle of blue jays picking through dew-wet leaves. But I had a strange feeling in my gut that today would not end in peace. It wasn't paranoia, it was rhythm. I had come to recognize the cycle of Dana's behavior like phases of the moon. She meddled, she retaliated, she escalated, and then she imploded before starting all over again. And she was overdue for another move. I sipped my coffee slowly as the sun broke through the trees, eyeing the screen of my phone where the live trail cam feeds flickered one by one. Feed 3 blinked to life, and I nearly choked on the coffee when I saw her. Dana, wearing black leggings, a Ridgepine sweatshirt, and gardening gloves for some reason, crouched next to my fence with a pair of wire cutters in one hand and a look of murderous concentration. She was trying to slice through the chain link section I had reinforced last week, struggling to snap the thick metal links with a tool clearly designed for flower stems. I tapped the record button, zoomed in, and watched for another 2 minutes until she gave up in frustration, kicked the post, and stormed back toward her yard. I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. I saved the video, added it to the digital folder labeled Dana Escalations, and smiled. This time I was going to let her keep digging her own grave until she fell all the way in. She hadn't realized she was being watched and that arrogance was going to be her downfall. By midday, I received another HOA courtesy notice tucked into my mailbox. It accused me of creating environmental hazards by obstructing natural wildlife paths and cited Rule 8.14, which according to the document prohibited the erection of structures that impeded deer migration. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. These people were now pretending to be conservationists just to get me to take my fence down. I had half a mind to buy a herd of deer and unleash them through Dana's bonsai. Instead, I forwarded the notice to the county game warden with a note that said, apparently, deer now need HOA approval to cross land. He wrote back with nothing but a laughing emoji and a thumbs up. The absurdity of it all was becoming almost theatrical, and I had front row seat. That afternoon, I heard the rumble of gravel and saw a tan county vehicle pull up outside the trailhead. It was the same zoning inspector who'd stopped by weeks earlier. He stepped out, hat tilted, clipboard in hand, and offered a friendly nod. "Got another complaint," he said. "This time something about improper fencing permits." I raised an eyebrow. "This is agricultural fencing under 10 feet, no permit required." He nodded. "Yep, but I have to come verify." We walked the fence line together. He inspected the posts, checked the survey markers, and took a few photos. "Honestly," he muttered, "I think they just want to see if they can wear you down." I smiled and handed him a printed copy of the deed and the survey again just for his file. As he left, I asked if I could buy him a cup of coffee next time he was in the area. He laughed. "Only if you promised to keep giving her ulcers." That night, I made another addition to the property. I installed a weatherproof box at the gate with laminated copies of the property deed, survey map, and a statement that read, "All inquiries regarding this land must be addressed in writing. No verbal complaints accepted. HOA members are not recognized on this property." It was a clear message. I wasn't interested in debate. The next morning, I found the laminated copy crumpled and tossed halfway down the trail. A petty move. A small tantrum, which meant Dana was losing her grip. That was when I decided it was time for a little noise, literal noise. I set up a few wireless outdoor speakers along the edge of the fence near the section closest to Dana's home. I didn't aim them at her property, just close enough for her to hear. That night, I triggered a loop of coyote howls and rustling leaves, just loud enough to sound real, but subtle enough to leave doubt. At 11:46 p.m., the trail cam caught Dana stumbling out onto her deck in a bathrobe with a flashlight, shouting at the trees. Her husband followed behind her holding a tennis racket like he expected to duel with wildlife. They stood there for 10 minutes, listening, looking, waiting. The next day, Dana called animal control. I watched from my porch as the officer poked around the fence, saw no signs of any predators, and told her there was nothing he could do. When she pointed toward my property and accused me of releasing wild animals to terrorize her, He looked so stunned that I thought he might start laughing in her face. Instead, he politely asked if she'd like to file a formal report. She said yes. He took her statement, then walked straight to my gate and asked if I had seen or heard anything strange lately. I said, yes, I had seen a woman in a bathrobe yelling into the woods last night. He chuckled, shook his head, and said, "Have a good evening." The games had become absurd, but I wasn't playing them out of cruelty. I was defending my land. And more importantly, I was forcing Dana to reckon with the one thing she'd never had to face: consequences. That week, I received a quiet message from someone I didn't expect. It was a handwritten note slid under my gate by one of the HOA board members, a man named Greg, who lived 2 streets over. The note was short. "For what it's worth, some of us know she's gone too far. If you ever need statements, I have records. She's been lying about the border for years." It wasn't just a crack in the armor. It was the first falling brick. I sent Greg a thank you card and didn't say anything more. But I knew now that Dana's kingdom was fracturing. People were starting to see past the clipped hedges and decorative mulch and realizing their queen had no clothes. By the end of the week, 3 more trail cams had caught Dana pacing along the fence line at different hours of the day, one of which showed her arguing with someone on the phone, gesturing wildly toward my property. I had compiled nearly 40 hours of footage, multiple documents, witness testimony, and zoning confirmations. The folder labeled Dana Escalations was now so detailed it could have been presented to a grand jury. I wasn't planning anything that dramatic. Not yet. But I printed it all out, bound it in a thick manila folder, and placed it in a lockbox in the cabin just in case, because there was a storm coming, not one of wind or rain, but of bureaucracy, ego, and humiliation. And when it hit, I would be ready. Dana thought she was still in control, still commanding her kingdom with a plastic scepter and HOA regulations printed on ivory cardstock. She didn't understand that the rules no longer applied here. Not on this land, not on my land. And if she kept pushing, she wasn't going to be slapped with another cease and desist. She was going to be removed, disgraced, and finally forced to learn the one lesson no one in Ridgepine had ever dared to teach her: that her power only existed because others let her pretend it did. And I was done pretending. The sign went up quietly one morning just before sunrise, when the air was still cold enough to bite, and not a single porch light in Ridgepine had flickered on. I bolted it to a post at the trailhead with slow, deliberate care, making sure it was level, reflective, and big enough to be read from the street. It read in bold black letters on white aluminum: "Private property no HOA access trespassers will be prosecuted." But it was the smaller line beneath that really caught attention: "All Ridgepine HOA members banned from entry by order of landowner." I didn't expect it to work miracles. Dana wasn't the type to take signs seriously. She saw them as mere suggestions that didn't apply to people with a title like hers. But that sign wasn't for her. It was for everyone else. The ones watching from their windows, too scared or too polite to say anything, unsure who was right, but growing more uncomfortable every day with the war at their borders. And the message was clear now. I wasn't just fighting back. I was shutting the gate forever. By noon, the whispers had already started. One of my trail cams picked up 3 residents standing at the end of the old path, squinting at the sign and muttering among themselves. One of them, a balding man in a polo shirt and sandals, pulled out his phone and took a photo. I assumed it would be forwarded to the HOA board within minute. Meanwhile, I added another sign to the back fence where the property brushed close to the community garden Ridgepine maintained. This one was harsher and no trespassing. No exceptions. HOA violations subject to civil charges. Beneath it, I zip-tied a laminated copy of my property deed just for sport. The reaction was better than I could have hoped for. That evening, Dana came storming across her yard like a cartoon villain. Red-faced and practically shaking as she pounded on the locked gate with the palm of her hand. I stayed seated on my porch until she shouted my name loud enough to rattle the windows. I walked down casually, drink in hand, and stopped 10 feet from the gate. She launched into a screed about discrimination, abuse of power, and something about the spiritual damage I was causing to the harmony of Ridgepine. I didn't say a word. I just pulled a folded letter from my pocket, held it up, and let her read the first line through the bars. It was a trespass warning with her name on it, signed and filed with the sheriff's office, valid for 1 year, renewable. Her mouth snapped shut, her hand dropped from the gate, and for once Dana had no words. She turned, marched back to her yard, and slammed her patio door so hard it echoed like a gunshot through the woods. I went back to my chair and smiled. I didn't see her for 3 days, but I saw the effects. The trail that used to see a dozen residents a day now stood empty. People walked their dogs in the street, stared at the woods like something dangerous lived in them. Rumors swirled. One person said I'd bought hunting dogs and trained them to patrol at night. Another claimed I'd installed motion-triggered sirens that went off if you got too close. I didn't correct any of it. Let the imagination do my work for me. What mattered was the fear. Not violent fear, just enough unease to finally give the land the respect it deserved. Then came the next move in Dana's desperate spiral. I got a letter from the sheriff's department requesting I come in for a voluntary interview. She had filed a complaint accusing me of targeting Ridgepine HOA members with malicious intent, citing her vehicle incident, the coyote sounds, the signs, and the ban. I brought my folder, every photo, every clip, every legal document. I laid it all out on the table and explained it chronologically, calmly, with dates, names, and clear reasoning. The deputy listened, nodded, and finally said, "I don't think we're going to have any issues on your end, Mr. McHale. You've been more than reasonable." I asked what would happen with her complaint. He gave a little shrug. "Let's just say we've had enough of her nonsense to start a bingo card." I thanked him and walked out knowing something had finally shifted in the wider world. Dana's credibility, once the unshakable backbone of Ridgepine, was now a splintered stick. That night, I invited a few friends up to the cabin for a bonfire. We grilled venison, drank beer, and shared stories by the fire while my trail cams quietly watched the perimeter. Around midnight, one of the cams pinged with motion. I checked the feed and saw 2 figures standing near the new signs at the garden fence. One of them pointed, said something I couldn't hear, and walked off. The other stood there for a long moment, head down, then followed. No damage, no confrontation, just quiet retreat, and that silence was louder than any scream Dana had ever thrown my way. But she wasn't finished. Oh no. The very next morning, a new flyer appeared in every Ridgepine mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting, Tuesday night. Agenda: escalating hostility from adjacent property owner. I knew I had to see it. Not from inside, of course, but close enough to hear. So, Tuesday evening, I sat in my truck, parked near the clubhouse with the windows down, sipping coffee while the voice of Ridgepine residents carried through the open windows. It started with Dana reciting a long list of my alleged infractions. Then, someone, Greg, I guessed from the tone, interrupted her. He started asking questions. Why hadn't she disclosed the real property lines when they first planned the community garden? Why had she allowed the HOA to find someone who wasn't a member? Why did half the residents only find out recently that the land didn't belong to them? Her answers got snippier, louder, more erratic. She accused residents of disloyalty, of falling for my manipulations. Someone shouted back that they were tired of fighting wars over imaginary threats. A woman asked why her teenage son had been scolded for walking near the woods when he hadn't crossed the fence. Dana snapped that if they aren't with her, they're against her. That was when the meeting exploded. Voices rose, chairs scraped. Someone banged the table. Someone else shouted about dues and misused funds. The last thing I heard before I rolled up my windows and drove off was a man yelling, "You've turned us into a laughingstock." That night, the HOA email Greg had once used to reach me sent another message. It read, "You're winning. She's cracking. Everyone can see it now. Keep going." I leaned back in my chair, stared out at the moonlight draping across my land, and let out a long breath. I hadn't planned on war when I first leased that land. I just wanted peace, quiet, and a place to hunt without someone breathing down my neck. But when peace was threatened by pettiness, by power-hungry people who thought fences and rules only applied to others, you had 2 choices. Give in or build higher fences. And I wasn't done building yet. The morning after the infamous HOA meeting, the entire neighborhood of Ridgepine had the eerie quiet of a town that had just been through a storm, but hadn't quite admitted it yet. Cars moved slower. Porch conversations stopped when anyone got too close, and the neighborhood group chat, according to Greg, was a digital battlefield full of passive-aggressive messages, silent departures, and mounting questions about how they had let things go this far. Dana, meanwhile, had gone full radio silent, which was strange for a woman who had previously sent out 3 emails a week about acceptable lawn gnome color schemes. Her silence, however, did not mean inaction. It meant something was coming, something desperate, and I could feel it even through the pine-thick border that separated my land from her fantasy kingdom. So, I kept watch, not like a paranoid doomsday prepper, but like someone who's been warned by nature too many times to ignore a strange calm. My trail cams were now upgraded with motion tracking AI, night vision, and solar chargers. I had footage coming in from every angle, including 2 new hidden cams that pointed directly toward the shared boundary near her backyard and the street entrance. I was gathering evidence, yes, but more than that, I was collecting truth. Undeniable, time-stamped, crystal clear truth that would matter when Dana made her final sloppy move. And she did. 3 days later, in the dead of night, my camera picked up a vehicle parking in the dark stretch near the far eastern gate. Out stepped a man I didn't recognize at first. Tall, wearing a hoodie and work gloves, carrying what looked like a bolt cutter and a pry bar. He approached the gate, looked around, then began working at the padlock like someone trying to pretend they weren't committing a felony. I waited, letting the camera record everything. When he finally got the lock popped and crept in, I activated the motion-triggered lights I'd installed near the fence line, bathing him in harsh white LED and triggering an alarm tone that blared through a hidden speaker. The man froze like a deer, spun around, and bolted back to the car. He drove off so fast he clipped a mailbox on his way out. I didn't chase him. I just saved the footage, enhanced the plate, and called the sheriff. When the deputy arrived that morning, I handed him a fresh mug of coffee, and showed him the full video. Within minutes, they had traced the license plate. The car was registered to Dana's cousin, who, according to public record, lived 3 towns away, but had visited Ridgepine just 2 days prior. The deputy didn't even need to ask me if I wanted to press charges. I nodded before he could finish the question. Trespassing, vandalism, attempted unlawful entry. It was more than enough to haul someone in. When they showed up at Dana's house to question her, I was told by a grinning neighbor who had watched it all unfold from his upstairs window. She screamed that it was a setup, a conspiracy, and then slammed the door in the deputy's face. Unfortunately for her, refusing to cooperate only made things worse. Within a day, the story made its way to a small local news blog, and from there, it spread like wildfire through social media. A HOA president accused of coordinating fence break-in against local landowner was the headline, complete with grainy stills of the man creeping near my gate. I didn't give a public statement, but the reporter had enough to run with, including prior documents, the boundary dispute, the meeting meltdown, and the long history of HOA complaints that no longer held water. Dana's reputation was cooked. The next HOA meeting, I'm told, was pure chaos. Greg sent me a voice memo recording of it, capturing the sound of shouting residents. One woman demanding to see the budget books, another threatening to stop paying dues altogether. Dana tried to explain, deflect, deny. But the story had escaped her mouth and now belonged to the people she once controlled. They voted. They didn't even need a second round. Effective immediately, Dana Ellers was removed as president of the Ridgepine HOA. No ceremonial handover, no farewell speech, just a stunned silence and a motion to appoint a temporary replacement until new elections could be held. Dana reportedly walked out, not with her head high, but clutching her purse like it was the last symbol of her authority, refusing to make eye contact with a single neighbor. The next morning, a real estate sign went up in her yard. Sleek, corporate, overpriced. She didn't even bother with a local agent. She hired some big city firm that promised a fast turnaround and luxury-level listings, but even they couldn't hide what was happening. Everyone knew the whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were statements. Dana's reign was over. And Ridgepine wasn't just relieved. It was laughing. I stayed out of it publicly. I didn't post, didn't brag, didn't wave a flag. I just kept living. I added a fresh layer of gravel to the driveway, planted 2 new trees along the creek, and helped an old friend build a fire pit behind the cabin. Peace had returned, but it wasn't the same kind of peace I'd started with. It was better. Earn hardened real. One afternoon, a delivery truck rolled up to my gate with a package from Greg. Inside was a bound folder labeled HOA Internal Confidential, filled with years of emails, budget records, and documented misconduct. It was everything I had suspected, all verified. He left a note inside. Figured you earned this. Thought it might help with whatever comes next. I didn't know what to do with it at first. Part of me wanted to bury it and move on. But the wiser part knew it had value, not for revenge, but for protection, for accountability, for anyone else who might try to pick up Dana's crown. I locked it away, just like the rest of my footage and paperwork, in a safe under the cabin floor. And as I did, I realized something that made me laugh out loud alone in the woods. Dana's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was assuming no one would ever fight back with more patience than she had control. She had built her empire on fear and assumed silence meant surrender. But it hadn't. It had meant planning timing. And now, long after her tantrums had faded into whispers, the land stood unbothered, mine clean, and resolute. Every stake in the ground held a story. Every fence panel had been paid for in full, and every sign posted at the edges told the world what I had learned firsthand. Respect isn't claimed through titles or rules scribbled on paper. It's earned by knowing exactly where your lines are and defending them when it counts. It was a crisp morning when the moving van finally showed up in front of Dana's house. An oversized beige beast of a truck that seemed to grunt in disapproval at the task ahead of it. The driver stood awkwardly on the curb, scanning the home like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to knock or run. And I stood on my porch, nursing a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, watching from a distance like one might watch the last scene of a play you never really asked to be cast in. Dana came out 10 minutes later, shoulders stiff, sunglasses on, despite the low-hanging clouds, barking instructions at the poor crew who were just trying to do their job. She moved like someone too proud to admit they had been defeated, but too tired to fake the confidence anymore. Her hair was tied back in a bun so tight it looked like it was trying to hold her whole face together, and her heels clicked furiously across the pavement as if each step was an argument against the world. She didn't look at me once, which was probably the greatest concession I would ever get from her. I stayed quiet, watching her pack the final fragments of her reign into cardboard boxes and wheeled dollies, each load like a weight lifted from Ridgepine's collective chest. There was no farewell, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, just the mechanical packing of trophies and throw pillows, memories and regret. The for sale sign still stood in her front yard, now with a bold red price reduced banner slapped across it like a public confession of miscalculation. Word had gotten around fast in the real estate world, and despite all the polish and fluff in the listing, no one wanted to buy a house that sat next to a man who had quietly demolished a queen's kingdom with legal filings and patience. I wasn't toxic. I was a reminder, a permanent fixture that whispered to every potential buyer that this neighborhood once thought it could win a battle it never understood. And now the battlefield was quiet. Just after noon, I saw a silver Lexus roll up slowly to the curb. It was hers, of course. The same one she'd parked illegally across my line months ago. The one I had fenced in without touching a hair on it. The one that had become a symbol of her arrogance and my resolve. She stepped out in her designer coat, keys dangling in one hand, and circled the back of the car, opening the hatch and removing a last set of tote bags like a queen evacuating the last jewels from a looted palace. She didn't speak to the movers. She barely looked at the house. But then she did something unexpected. She walked right toward the fence. Not fast, not furious, just steadily, like a woman who needed to confront the one thing she hadn't yet admitted to herself. I stood up slowly, setting the mug down and walking to the gate as she approached it. Heels crunching on the gravel until she stood just outside the locked panel. We stared at each other for a long, hard moment. She cleared her throat and glanced toward the trail as if looking for the words she had rehearsed. "I need to get something," she said finally. I said nothing. She gestured toward the back edge of the property. "I left a bird feeder hanging on that oak. It was a gift from my father. I didn't want to leave it. I nodded once, then turned around, walked the path, and retrieved the dusty wooden feeder that still hung by a freight wire, swaying gently in the wind. I carried it back, stopped at the gate, and handed it to her without a word. She looked at it for a moment, held it tightly in both hands, and gave the faintest nod before turning and walking back toward her car. No thank you, no apology, no recognition of what had passed between us. Just the silence of someone who understood too late that the war they had started had never really been winnable. And maybe that was enough. I watched the Lexus drive away for the last time, tires crunching over the familiar gravel as she pulled away from the place she had once ruled like a kingdom of rules and fines. The moving truck followed a few minutes later, creaking and rumbling down the road, and by mid-afternoon, the house stood empty, hollow, a beige skeleton of ambition that no longer cast a shadow over my land. I walked the fence line, slowly, checking the posts, the gates, the cameras. Everything was still in place. Everything was quiet. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not victory, but calm. True earned calm. Not the kind that comes from running away or ignoring a problem, but the kind that grows out of knowing you stood your ground when it mattered. That evening, Greg stopped by with a six-pack and a grin. We sat by the fire pit behind the cabin, the smell of pine and smoke curling in the air, and talked about nothing for a while. Just two guys, feet up, watching the flames dance. After a long silence, he said, "You know, some of us didn't realize how bad it had gotten. We just thought it was how things were, that someone like her was necessary to keep order." I nodded slowly. Order's fine, as long as it doesn't come with a leash. He laughed. Well, she's gone and we're trying to fix things. Actually, fix them. No more secret meetings. No more fines for stuff nobody agreed on. I think we're going to be all right. I looked out over the land, over the fence line, and the trails and the trees that had stood longer than any HOA rule ever would. You will be, I said, as long as you remember where the line is. He raised a beer and we clinked bottles without ceremony. The stars came out later, scattered across the black like someone had spilled silver dust over the heavens. I stood at the gate for a long while after Greg left. Hands in my pockets, listening to the night. Coyotes howled faintly in the distance. An owl hooted somewhere to the west, and in the wind there was no tension, no bitterness, no echo of Dana's screeching commands, only the sound of nature reclaiming the air. The land felt right again. Not just because it was mine, not just because the paperwork said so, but because it was finally allowed to breathe, to exist without being smothered by power games and paper crowns. The next morning, I added one final piece to the fence. A small sign carved by hand, simple and unassuming. It said, "Welcome to McHale Ridge." I stood back and looked at it. Then walked up the porch steps, leaned against the rail, and smiled. Not because I had one, but because I had endured, because I had stood up when it would have been easier to fold. Because I had chosen patience over fury, clarity over chaos. And now, as the breeze rolled across the grass and the sun spilled golden light across the woods, I realized I hadn't just defended my land. I had reclaimed something far rarer, peace. And no one, not Dana, not the HOA, not even the next storm that would one day come could take that from me again.